She thought it was her father coming home through the storm. But when 8-year-old Emily Carter opened the cabin door that night, the wind carried in something else. A man in a torn police uniform collapsing into the snow, and beside him, his German shepherd barely breathing, eyes glazed with pain. No one else was around, no roads open, no signal in the storm. What she did next would change everything for them all. Some call it courage. Others call it a miracle born from the kindness of a child. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below, and let's see where this story takes us tonight. The wind over Aspen Hollow howled like a living thing, curling around the pines and rattling the frozen roofs of the small Wyoming town. The storm had rolled in before sunset and never stopped, swallowing the valley in white silence. On the edge of the forest, where the last light from town vanished into trees, a modest log cabin stood buried halfway in snow. Inside, the air was warm and dim, flickering with the yellow light of a wood stove. 8-year-old Emily Carter sat close to the fire, her small body wrapped in a thick knitted sweater the color of oatmeal, her wool hat pulled low over strands of bright blonde hair that caught the glow like threads of gold. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold that crept through the walls, her blue eyes fixed on the door, listening. She wore thick socks that barely reached her knees and an oversized cardigan that once belonged to her mother. The night pressed in around her, and in that quiet, she felt both brave and very small. Her father, Jack Carter, had left before dusk, just as the first flakes started falling. He was a tall man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and calm, with short dark brown hair streaked in silver. Before the war, people said his presence could still a room. Now, years later, he carried that same quiet strength into every shift at the Ranger outpost. He had left wearing his olive green field jacket, dark jeans, and his black baseball cap with the white word "veteran" stitched across the brim. Emily remembered how he'd crouched before leaving, resting a heavy hand on her shoulder and saying softly, "Keep the fire going, sweetheart. I'll be back before morning." Then he smiled the kind of smile that always made her believe him, no matter how bad the weather. But tonight, the storm sounded different, wilder, heavier, as if the whole mountain had begun to breathe. Hours passed, the snow piled against the window ledges, and the glass shuddered with every gust. Emily fed another log into the stove and sat back down. The old clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, a reminder of how empty the cabin was without her father's voice. She tried reading from the small storybook on the table, but the letters swam in the dim light. Then, somewhere beyond the steady beat of the wind, came a faint sound. She frowned, tilting her head. It came again, a soft thud. Thud, dull and irregular. Her heart skipped. Someone, or something, was outside. At first she told herself it was only a branch. The forest groaned under the weight of ice. Trees snapped all the time. But then came another sound, closer, deliberate, a knock, slow and heavy, as if from a hand too weak to finish the motion. Emily set down her book, every muscle tight. The fire crackled behind her. She rose, hesitated at the door, her small hand hovering over the latch. "Dad?" she called softly. No answer, only wind. She held her breath and listened. Another knock. It wasn't loud, but it was full of exhaustion, like someone clinging to the last of their strength. Fear prickled at her skin, yet something deeper, curiosity, compassion, pushed her forward. The latch lifted with a faint click. The door cracked open against the wind, and a sheet of snow swept across the floor. Emily shielded her eyes, squinting through the swirl of white. For a moment she saw nothing, only the chaos of the storm. Then, as the lantern's light spilled across the porch, she gasped. A man lay sprawled half-buried in snow, face pale and lips blue, wearing a dark navy police jacket torn across one shoulder. Blood had frozen into the fabric near his arm. Beside him, a large German shepherd lay motionless, except for a faint rise and fall of its chest. Its fur, thick and sable-colored, was crusted with ice and streaks of dirt. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, catching the lantern glow before dimming again. Emily's breath hitched. She dropped to her knees, reaching toward the man's shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" There was no reply, only the ragged rhythm of shallow breathing. She felt the sting of snow against her cheeks. her small fingers trembling as she tried to pull him toward the threshold. He was heavy, dead weight, but she planted her boots and leaned back with all her strength, inch by inch dragging him inside. The dog whimpered faintly, its head lifting once before falling back against the drift. Emily turned, heart hammering, and reached for it too. "Come on, boy," she whispered through her teeth, tugging at its collar. "You're coming in too." Somehow, fueled by fear and stubborn kindness, she managed to pull both man and dog into the cabin. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the roar of the blizzard. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the ragged gasps from the stranger. Emily stood over them, panting. The man's uniform bore a faint badge, State Police, Wyoming. His skin looked waxen in the firelight. She ran to fetch a blanket from her bed and wrapped it around him, tucking the edges near his chest. The dog she covered with her own quilt, pressing a hand to its side. It was cold, but still breathing. "You're safe now," she murmured, the words barely more than a breath. She hurried to the stove and added more wood until the flames roared back to life. The orange light spilled over the cabin walls, painting everything in warmth. She found a clean rag, dampened it with warm water from the kettle, and gently wiped the man's face. Blood streaked across the cloth, and she saw a deep gash on his shoulder. Her father had taught her once, "If you can't heal the wound, stop the bleeding." She tore a strip from an old towel and pressed it tightly against the cut, tying it off as best she could. Then she turned to the dog, checking its paws, its ears, anything that looked hurt. It whimpered softly but didn't resist. When she was done, Emily sank back onto her heels, chest rising and falling quickly. The stranger's breathing had steadied, though shallow. The dog's sides moved faintly, its fur beginning to dry in the heat. She poured warm water into a cup and tried to lift the man's head enough for him to sip, but his lips only twitched. "Please," she whispered, "don't die." Her voice cracked on the last word. The fire popped behind her, the sound sharp as a spark flew toward the rug. She stamped it out, then looked toward the window. Beyond the frost, she thought she saw the faint glint of light, like a car headlamp far down the road, but it vanished before she could be sure. Her small hands fumbled with the old radio set sitting on the shelf. The casing was dented, one knob missing, but it still worked sometimes when her father was near. She pressed the button. "Ranger Station, this is Cabin 12. My name's Emily Carter. There's a police officer here. He's hurt. Please respond." Only static answered, long and cold. She tried again, her voice breaking. "Dad, it's me. Please come home." The hiss of white noise was the only reply. She let go of the transmitter and sank back to the floor. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She couldn't tell anymore. The storm raged outside, battering the walls, but inside, the world had grown small. Just her, the man, and the dog. She sat near the fire, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on the two strangers lying in its glow. The man's face looked softer now, the harsh lines eased by warmth. The dog shifted, a low sigh escaping its throat. Emily reached out to touch its head gently, whispering, "Good boy. Stay with him." Her breath fogged in the air between them. The lamp flickered once and she glanced again at the door, half expecting it to move. The wind had settled into a low moan that filled every corner of the cabin. Somewhere deep in the forest, something cracked, a branch or maybe something else. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer she only half remembered. Then she stood, added another log to the fire, and pulled the blanket higher over the man's shoulders. He looked peaceful now, as if the storm could no longer reach him. Outside, the snow kept falling, endless and thick. The light she'd seen earlier was gone, swallowed by the white. Whoever had left them there had disappeared into the storm, leaving behind only the faint tracks that were already fading. Inside, the cabin held steady, its small fire burning defiantly against the dark. And though the night was far from over, something unspoken had begun, a quiet thread of mercy stretching between a frightened child, a dying man, and a loyal dog who refused to leave his master's side. By the time dawn broke over Aspen Hollow, the storm had thinned into a gray, whispering snowfall, drifting like smoke between the trees. The world outside the cabin was still and white, the kind of stillness that follows chaos when even the forest seems to hold its breath. Inside, the fire burned low, a thin ribbon of smoke curling up the chimney. Emily sat on the floor, her head resting on her knees, eyes half closed from exhaustion. The stranger lay wrapped in blankets near the hearth, his breathing steadier now, while the big German shepherd, Rex, slept beside him, its muzzle twitching faintly in dreams. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. The air was heavy but calm, the kind of morning that made everything feel uncertain, as if the world hadn't quite decided whether it would let the day begin. The first sound came like a sigh, the slow drag of breath followed by a low groan. Emily blinked awake, startled. She turned toward the man, seeing his eyelids flutter beneath lashes coated faintly with frost that hadn't fully melted. He coughed once, a dry, painful sound that tore through the silence, and his hand twitched toward the dog. Emily rushed closer, her small voice trembling but warm. "You're okay. You're safe now," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. The man's lips parted, and for a long second, he seemed lost between waking and memory. Then his voice came, rough and cracked. "Rex!" The dog stirred instantly, head lifting, one ear cocked. The sight of him alive seemed to pull the man fully into the present. He tried to sit up but winced, his hand clutching the bandaged shoulder. Emily reached for him instinctively, steadying him with both arms even though her strength was small compared to his weight. His eyes, when they finally focused, were a striking shade of steel gray, clear but weary, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and stopped expecting comfort. "You're in my house," she told him, her voice still gentle. "You were outside in the snow. I brought you in." The man looked around, taking in the wooden walls, the crackling stove, the small boots by the door. "I owe you my life," he said finally, the words barely above a whisper. "Name's Daniel Hayes, Officer Daniel Hayes, Wyoming State Police." He paused, breathing through the pain, his voice softening as his gaze found the dog again. "And that brave soul, he's Rex, my partner." Daniel looked to be in his mid-30s, his face roughened by days in the cold, jaw covered in the dark stubble of fatigue. His hair, once neatly trimmed, was now matted from the storm, his uniform torn and stained with dried blood. Yet despite the wear, there was a strength about him, a steadiness that came not from power, but endurance. He tried to lift his injured arm, but stopped, grimacing. Emily fetched the canteen again and offered it to him. He drank greedily, water spilling from the corner of his mouth, then leaned back with a faint smile of gratitude. "You shouldn't have opened that door," he said hoarsely. "But thank you. If you hadn't, we wouldn't have made it till morning." His tone was half wonder, half disbelief, as if the thought of being saved by a child was something his mind couldn't fully accept. Rex nudged closer, resting his head on Daniel's leg. The man reached down, fingers brushing the dog's ear. "You saved me again, didn't you, buddy?" he murmured. The German shepherd wagged his tail weakly, the sound of it soft against the blanket. Emily watched them, her face glowing in the firelight. "He didn't leave you," she said quietly. "He stayed out there until I found you both." Daniel looked at her, eyes softening further. "That's what partners do," he replied. "He pulled me out of a burning car last night before I blacked out. I don't even remember the last mile. Only snow and pain. Then nothing." He looked toward the window, where light filtered pale and thin. Guess he walked till he couldn't anymore. The silence after that sentence felt sacred, something unspoken passing between the three of them, a small circle of survival carved out of a vast, uncaring storm. Emily stirred the fire again, the light flaring against the window. "My dad's coming home soon," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "He works at the ranger station up north. He knows what to do." Daniel nodded slowly. "Your father's a ranger?" She nodded. "Jack Carter." The name made him pause, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, though he said nothing at first. He took another sip of water, letting the name roll silently in his mind like a ghost half-remembered. Then, quietly, "Jack Carter. I've heard that name." His tone wasn't suspicious, only thoughtful, as if the pieces of something long buried had just shifted. He let the thought fade for now and looked back at Emily. "You've got courage, kid. More than most adults I know." She smiled faintly, embarrassed, but his words seemed to ease something in her small shoulders. The first rays of daylight crept through the frosted windows, throwing gold across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the storm had quieted to a whisper, the forest heavy with silence again. Then, faint at first, came the crunch of boots in snow. Emily froze, her eyes darting to the door. For a heartbeat, her mind flashed to the strange lights she'd seen hours earlier, but then a familiar sound followed, a low whistle, the same tune her father always used when returning from patrol. She ran to the door, heart leaping, and pulled it open before the second whistle finished. Jack Carter stood there, his olive field jacket crusted with snow, his black cap dusted white, his breath curling in the morning cold. He stepped inside, stamping his boots, and his voice broke through the hush. "Emily, thank God you're safe." He stopped. Mid-step, as his eyes caught the scene, a stranger in uniform lying near the fire, his daughter kneeling beside him, and a large police dog half asleep on the rug. Jack's brow furrowed, the soldier in him instantly alert. "What in God's name happened here?" he asked, though his tone stayed calm, deliberate. Emily ran to him and hugged his waist, her small body trembling. "He was outside, Dad. He and his dog. I brought them in." Jack's gaze moved from her to the man, then back to her, a flicker of pride in his eyes despite the confusion. Daniel tried to stand, wincing. "Sir," he said, voice rough but steady, "Officer Daniel Hayes, Wyoming State Police. I owe your daughter my life." Jack crouched beside him, taking in the wound, the blood-soaked sleeve, the faint tremor in his hand. "You're lucky she opened that door," he said evenly. "Storm like that could have buried you by dawn." Daniel nodded faintly. "It almost did." Jack fetched a small first aid kit from the shelf, tightening the bandage with practiced hands. His movements were quiet, methodical, the way soldiers do things when words would only get in the way. "What happened out there?" he asked after a long pause. Daniel looked toward the fire, as though gathering the strength to speak. "We were tracking a transport convoy," he began slowly. "An illegal route through the northern pass. Weapons, maybe people. I had a team in position, but before we could close in, they hit us. 3 vehicles. We never saw them coming. They were using military ordnance, incendiary rounds. My car went up first. Rex pulled me out." He glanced at the dog, who was now watching him quietly, amber eyes alert, even in fatigue. "I made it a few miles before the cold got to me. The rest is a blur." Jack's jaw tightened. Something in the officer's words tugged at an old scar deep inside him. Daniel continued, the tone of his voice turning darker, heavier with memory. "They called themselves the Harper Syndicate. They've been running contraband across 3 states. I've been on their trail for months." He paused, catching Jack's reaction. The older man's eyes narrowed, his hand stilling on the bandage. "Harper," he repeated quietly, as if the name itself was poison. The air between them changed, thicker now, weighted with something personal. Jack sat back slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment he didn't speak, only stared at the floor as the name sank deeper. When he finally lifted his gaze, his voice was quieter, steadier, but colder somehow. "I know that name," he said. "They were the ones who supplied weapons in Pine Ridge during the war. My unit got caught in one of their accidents. Half my men didn't make it out." Daniel's face showed recognition now. He had read that report years ago, an explosion that was never fully explained. One survivor listed as Sergeant Jack Carter. The silence stretched between them, like a wound reopening in the light. "So it's not over," Jack murmured at last, staring into the fire. "They've come back." Emily looked between them, confused, but sensing something heavy she couldn't yet understand. Rex stirred beside her and rested his head on her lap, grounding the moment with quiet presence. Daniel leaned back, exhaustion claiming him again, but his last words before sleep were soft and certain. "If it's them, they won't stop." Jack didn't answer. He stood, looking out through the window where the storm had passed, but the cold still clung to the glass. Outside, the forest stood silent, blanketed in white. Inside, the fire snapped softly, the only warmth in a world that suddenly felt much colder. The afternoon in Aspen Hollow settled into a fragile calm, the kind that follows too much revelation. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving the world washed clean and unnervingly still. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney into a sky so pale it seemed to have lost its color. Inside, the fire burned low, its light flickering over Jack Carter's worn face as he sat across from Daniel Hayes at the small kitchen table. Between them lay a half-drawn map of the northern forest, old ranger charts marked with faded trails and handwritten notes from Jack's service years. The silence stretched long before Daniel spoke, his voice low, heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "The Harper Syndicate isn't just another gang," he began, tracing a gloved finger along one of the mountain routes. "They've been hiding behind a front company, Ravenwood Timber. On paper, it's a logging operation with permits from 3 states, but in reality, it's a pipeline. They move stolen weapons, drugs, and sometimes people through the back roads your rangers built decades ago." Jack's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He remembered the Ravenwood trucks, the ones that used to rumble past the Pine Ridge checkpoints back when he still wore a uniform. "They've been doing this under everyone's nose," Daniel continued. "The roads cut through state land. No checkpoints, no eyes. It's perfect cover." Jack leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark graying hair. "That's how they did it," he muttered more to himself than to Daniel. 10 years ago there was a mission, classified, or so they said. We were told to secure a transport convoy in Pine Ridge, but when we got there, the trucks were empty. Then came the explosion. They called it an accident. I lost my best friend that night, Captain Jack Hensley. He was the only one who suspected those shipments weren't military. Said someone was using the war as camouflage. Jack's gaze drifted toward the fire, the orange glow deepening the lines of grief that had never faded. Daniel watched quietly, realizing that the story he'd stumbled into was older and darker than his own investigation. Emily, sitting quietly on the couch with Rex's head resting on her lap, looked between them without speaking. The big German shepherd was alert now, his fur brushed clean, a bandage wrapped neatly around his side. Every time Jack's voice dropped low, Rex's ears flicked, as if he too remembered things that couldn't be unseen. The clock ticked softly, the sound small but grounding. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, a field report smudged with ash. "We have files on Ravenwood," he said, "names, dates, and supply chains. But we've lost contact with our undercover unit near the timber site. If Harper knows I'm alive, he'll burn it all before we get there." Jack rose, crossing to the window. The forest beyond were silent except for the wind brushing through the pines. "The snow covers everything," he said quietly. "Tracks, evidence, even guilt." He turned back toward Daniel. "You can't reach your people from here. The storm knocked the radio towers. You'll need to use the old ranger line, wired directly through the North Pass. It's not much, but it still works when satellites go dead." He gestured toward the door. "We'll go after sunset. Less chance of being seen." Daniel nodded, though his face was drawn with fatigue. "If I make it back to headquarters," he said, "I can get federal support. Harper's been untouchable for years because no one could link him to the killings." Jack's voice lowered. "You just did." The afternoon faded into a dull amber glow that slid across the cabin floor. Emily went to refill Rex's bowl with melted snow, humming softly, trying to ease the tension that hung like frost in the air. Jack gathered a few supplies, a flashlight, 2 handguns, a battered field map, preparing quietly, his movements deliberate. Daniel sat watching him, the bond between soldier and officer forming wordlessly, built on shared understanding of duty and the ghosts that follow it. When Jack finally looked up, his expression had shifted. "They killed Hensley," he said flatly. "If Harper's still out there, I want him found." Just as Daniel opened his mouth to respond, Rex suddenly stiffened, ears pricking toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, deep and steady. Emily froze, her hand hovering above the dog's back. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Rex didn't move, eyes locked on the window. Jack followed his gaze. There, barely visible against the snow, were footprints, not from earlier. Fresh. He crossed the room in 2 strides and peered through the frost-glazed glass. The tracks circled the porch once, then disappeared into the tree line. His heartbeat slowed, the kind of slow that comes from habit rather than fear. "We're not alone," he said under his breath. Daniel pushed himself up, wincing as his shoulder protested. Jack held out a hand. Stay down. You're not ready. He reached for the lamp and turned the wick low until the room dimmed. The fire's glow became their only light, stretching their shadows long and thin across the walls. Emily's eyes widened as Jack moved with quiet precision, sliding the bolt on the door, checking the windows, pulling the curtains tight. Rex followed each motion with silent obedience, his tail stiff, his posture alert. The cabin that had felt like a refuge hours before now seemed smaller, the walls pressing inward with every gust of wind outside. Minutes passed. The only sound was the soft creak of wood as the wind brushed the cabin's sides. Then came a faint crunch in the snow, too deliberate to be nature. Jack motioned for silence, his finger to his lips. He took position by the door, one hand on the rifle propped beside. The frame. The sound came again, closer this time, then stopped entirely. Rex's growl deepened, a low warning like thunder waiting to break. Emily's breath hitched, her small hands clenching around the edge of the couch. Jack exhaled slowly, waiting for whatever would come next. Then, a voice, muffled but urgent, cut through the dark. "Jack Carter? Officer Hayes? Don't shoot. It's Nora Bell." Jack hesitated for half a second before unlocking the door. The figure that stumbled inside was half covered in snow, her police parka torn at one sleeve, hair plastered to her forehead beneath a navy beanie. Sergeant Nora Bell was in her late 20s, lean and sharp-eyed, with a look that mixed exhaustion and defiance in equal measure. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her voice was steady. "They know you're alive," she said, breathing hard. "Harper's people are sweeping the ridge. They've already hit the ranger outpost. We don't have much time." Her words dropped like stones into the silence. Daniel rose from his chair, pain flashing across his face. "Nora," he managed, relief and dread tangled in the sound. "How?" She shook her head, snow scattering from her hair. "I tailed them from the timber site. They thought you were dead. When they realized the car was empty, they sent men to finish the job, 2 black SUVs. I lost them near the river bend, but they'll track here soon." Jack closed the door behind her, bolting it again. His voice remained calm, though his eyes had hardened. "Then we're out of time." Nora glanced toward Emily, who was staring wide-eyed beside the dog. "You have a kid here?" Jack nodded. "She's my daughter." The sergeant's expression softened for an instant, but only briefly. "Then we move now," she said. "If Harper's hunting you, this cabin won't stand a chance once they find it." The fire flared as Jack threw another log in, more out of habit than warmth. Outside, the light was fading fast, the snow reflecting the last traces of day. Inside, the air grew thick with unspoken fear and grim determination. Rex stood by the door, tail rigid, as if ready to face whatever waited beyond. Jack looked at Daniel, then at Nora. "If they're coming," he said quietly, "they'll find more than they bargained for." The storm had ended, but the war that followed it had only begun to breathe. Night fell heavy over Aspen Hollow, swallowing what little peace the day had left. The snow, once calm and silver under the moon, began to whip again across the valley in fitful bursts. Inside the Carter cabin, the fire had been banked low, and the air hummed with a quiet dread that no one dared to voice. Jack stood near the window, watching the tree line through the narrow slit between the curtains, while Daniel sat cleaning his sidearm with methodical focus, every movement slow but certain. Nora checked the magazine of her rifle near the door, her breath steady despite the tension tightening her jaw. Emily and Rex huddled close to the hearth, the little girl's fingers buried in the dog's thick fur. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock, a heartbeat counting down toward something they could all feel coming. Then, through the wind, came a noise that didn't belong to nature, a low, mechanical growl followed by the crunch of tires on ice. Jack's eyes sharpened. "Engines," he said under his breath. Daniel looked up instantly. The sound grew louder, splitting the stillness apart. Lights flickered through the trees, bouncing red against the snow before cutting out completely. Silence again. Nora moved to the window, peering into the dark. "They've killed the lights," she murmured. "They're closing in." Jack nodded once, the soldier in him resurfacing without hesitation. He turned to Emily. "Stay low. Keep Rex beside you. No matter what happens, don't move unless I say." Emily nodded, her lips trembling but determined. She buried her face against Rex's neck, feeling his low rumble vibrate through her palms like a living warning. The first shot came from the ridge, sharp, distant, hitting the porch beam in a spray of splinters. Jack ducked instinctively, pulling the lamp cord to darken the room. The fire still glowed faintly, throwing ghost-like shadows across the walls. "They're testing distance," Daniel said quietly. "Next one won't miss." Jack grabbed his rifle and slipped toward the side window, his movements silent, practiced. Outside, figures moved between the trees, 3, maybe 4, their silhouettes merging with the dark. Then, a flash, something metallic rolling across the snow, landing against the porch with a muffled thud. Jack shouted, "Down!" As the flashbang went off, light and sound erupting into chaos. Glass shattered, fire roared, and the front of the cabin burst into a shower of sparks. Flames climbed the wooden frame like claws, licking up toward the roof. Emily screamed, but Nora pulled her down, shielding her with her body. Rex barked, low and fierce, lunging toward the doorway as the air filled with smoke. Jack fired 2 rounds through the broken window, the recoil echoing across the walls. One of the attackers fell back into the snow, silent. Daniel pushed himself to his feet despite the pain in his shoulder. "We hold the line here," he said, voice raw but steady. Jack gave a sharp nod. "You take the left, I'll cover the back." The next assault came fast, Molotov flames arcing through the night, crashing against the cabin's siding. Fire bloomed bright orange against the snow, the heat and cold colliding in a surreal dance. The crackle of burning timber mixed with the pop of gunfire and the deep roar of the storm returning over the ridge. Daniel crouched by the doorway, shooting between flashes, his breath harsh in the smoke. Nora moved beside him, eyes narrowed, firing in controlled bursts. "They're trying to corner us," she said through clenched teeth. "They'll burn us out if they can't get a shot." Jack glanced toward the back room, where Emily and Rex were huddled beneath the table. "Not while I'm breathing," he muttered, loading another magazine. But the fire spread faster than any of them expected. The old wood, dry and worn by years of cold, caught instantly. The ceiling cracked, showering ash and sparks. Rex barked sharply, pulling away from Emily just as a flaming beam collapsed behind them, sealing the rear exit. Smoke poured in thick waves, choking the air. "Dad!" Emily cried, coughing. Jack turned, his heart seizing at the sight, flames curling toward her, his daughter's silhouette flickering through the smoke. He started forward, but Rex was faster. The dog lunged through the fire, teeth clenched, body low, knocking the beam aside enough for Emily to crawl free. She stumbled into Jack's arms, sobbing, while Rex howled as burning debris singed his back. The sight froze everyone for a breath. Man, soldier, child, all reduced to the raw, instinctive fight for life. Daniel saw the dog collapse, smoke rising from his fur, and without thinking, he ran straight into the fire. "Rex!" he shouted, his voice breaking as heat clawed at his skin. He threw his jacket over the dog, lifting him against his chest, the smell of burned fabric filling his lungs. "I've got you, partner," he whispered through gritted teeth. Jack appeared in the doorway, firing again toward the trees to cover them. "Move!" he barked. Daniel stumbled through the smoke, Rex limp in his arms as the roof groaned above them, seconds from giving way. Together, they crashed through the back door just as the cabin collapsed behind them in a roar of flame and splintering wood. The cold outside hit like a slap, air biting through the heat still clinging to their clothes. Daniel fell to his knees in the snow, laying Rex down gently. The dog's chest rose shallowly, his fur blackened in patches, steam curling from his sides. Emily knelt beside them, tears streaking her soot-covered cheeks. Jack crouched nearby, scanning the ridge. The glow of headlights cut through the trees again, this time brighter, stronger. Sirens followed, distant but real. "State Patrol!" Nora shouted, pointing toward the flashing red-blue lights bouncing across the snow. The backup Daniel had radioed. Before losing signal had finally reached them. Within minutes, the valley erupted with command shouts and the crunch of boots. Figures in tactical gear fanned out through the tree line, rifles trained on the attackers still firing from the ridge. One by one, they were pinned down and disarmed under the glare of floodlights. At the center of the chaos stood a tall man in a dark winter coat, his expression hard and cold as the night itself. Harper. The leader of the Syndicate raised his hands slowly, his voice carrying mock calm. "Guess you finally found me, Officer Hayes." Daniel stared back, silent, too spent to reply. Harper smirked once before being forced to the ground, his wrists bound in metal. The blue lights painted the snow around him, turning the world surreal and unearthly, violence subdued under the color of justice. Jack turned toward the remnants of the cabin. It was nothing now but a heap of burning timber and smoke, glowing faintly under the police lights. He stood there for a long moment, eyes reflecting the fire. So much had ended here, his ghosts, the old war, the silence he'd carried for years. Emily tugged at his sleeve, voice trembling. "Dad? Rex?" Jack knelt beside Daniel, who was holding the dog's paw, his hand shaking despite the calm on his face. "You did it, buddy," Daniel whispered, voice raw, breaking in the cold air. "You brought her out, you did your job." The dog's eyes flickered open for a heartbeat. His tongue moved weakly, brushing Daniel's gloved hand. A faint whine escaped him, small but unmistakable, a sound of life, of endurance. Emily gasped softly. Jack exhaled, the first breath that wasn't war or fear. Around them, the storm eased, snowflakes drifting gently through the red-blue haze. The cabin was gone, but something far greater had survived. In the quiet that followed, 3 humans and 1 battered German shepherd sat together in the cold, the sound of sirens fading into the distance, leaving only the soft rhythm of breathing and the promise that hope still lived, even in the ruins. When the snow finally receded from the valley, Aspen Hollow breathed again. What had been a field of ash and broken timber now shimmered under a gentle sun, the ground damp and rich with the scent of pine sap and thawed soil. The birds returned first, cautious at the edges of the forest, then the deer, their hooves leaving fresh tracks where the fire had passed. At the heart of the clearing, the Carter cabin stood rebuilt, smaller, sturdier, its wooden walls golden in the morning light. The locals called it the Hearth, a name born from what it symbolized rather than what it was. It had become more than a home. It was a quiet monument to survival, to courage, to the small hands and loyal paws that had kept life burning through one of the darkest nights the town had ever known. Daniel Hayes arrived that morning with the spring wind at his back, his left arm still wrapped with a brace, though the wound beneath had long closed. His face carried new lines, but they were softer now, less from pain and more from purpose. His uniform, freshly pressed, bore the insignia of the Wyoming State Police, and, pinned beside it, a small silver tag engraved with a name, Rex. The dog trotted beside him, healed though slower, the burn scars hidden beneath the thick sable of his coat. He walked with that proud, steady gait of a soldier who'd been to the edge and come back, his amber eyes calm, his demeanor dignified, as if he understood that this world now looked to him as something more than an animal, something living that had come to define the word hero. The ceremony that day was simple, the way mountain folk preferred things. A handful of townspeople gathered near the ranger outpost as the wind swept across the pines, carrying the smell of pine needles and new grass. The sheriff, a man with silver hair and the habit of clearing his throat before saying anything emotional, stepped forward with a small metal case in hand. "For bravery and service beyond duty," he said, his voice low but sure. Daniel accepted the commendation quietly, nodding once. Then the sheriff knelt, clasping a medal around Rex's collar. It was polished brass, gleaming under the light. The inscription read, "K9 Hero of the State of Wyoming." The crowd applauded softly, respectful, and for a moment the dog looked up, blinking as though uncertain why the world had turned its attention to him. But when Emily clapped the loudest, smiling through tears, Rex's tail wagged just once, slow, dignified, as if to say the only approval that mattered was hers. Afterward, Daniel walked the perimeter of the clearing with Jack Carter, their boots sinking into soft mud where snowmelt had carved rivulets through the grass. The 2 men moved like brothers who didn't need words to fill the spaces between them. Jack wore his olive-green field jacket again, though it looked lighter now, the burden it once carried fading into the past. "You've got new recruits starting next week," Jack said, glancing toward the training field Daniel had been preparing. "The rookies won't know what hit them." Daniel smiled faintly. "They'll learn," he replied. "This valley teaches fast." He looked out across the pines, the line where forest met sky. "I figured you'd help me run a few drills. I could use a man who knows how to listen to the wind." Jack chuckled softly, the sound rare but honest. You always did know how to talk a soldier back into service. By afternoon, the valley had warmed to the color of honey. The sound of hammering echoed faintly from the new ranger shed, mingling with the laughter of a child. Emily sat cross-legged by the porch, a blanket draped over her lap. Rex lay beside her, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in the sunlight. She traced her small fingers along the scar that ran across his shoulder, the mark where fire had kissed him but failed to claim him. "Does it still hurt?" she asked softly, though she knew he couldn't answer. The dog turned his head slightly, pressing his muzzle against her palm. She smiled. "Dad says scars are proof that we're stronger than what tried to break us." Rex gave a soft huff of air that sounded almost like agreement. Around them, spring hummed, a quiet orchestra of life resuming where silence once ruled. Jack watched from the steps, his face caught between pride and a sadness only fathers know, the kind that comes when they realize their children are growing braver than they ever were. Daniel approached with 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to him. "She's got your spirit," he said, "and her mother's heart." Jack nodded, eyes still on Emily. "She saw too much for her age," he murmured, "but maybe that's what gives her the strength to see what others can't." Daniel didn't reply. They stood side by side, looking toward the horizon where the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting the world in copper and gold. For a long time, neither man spoke, and yet everything that needed saying hung between them, the gratitude, the bond, the silent promise that they would carry forward what had been saved that night. Weeks slipped by like water over smooth stones. Aspen Hollow came alive again. Children playing in thawed fields, old men mending fences, and the faint hum of saws rebuilding what the fire had taken. Jack and Daniel spent their mornings at the training grounds, teaching young recruits how to track in snow and navigate mountain rescues. Rex became part of the lessons, his calm obedience a standard for the new K-9 units. In the evenings, they'd sit by the rebuilt porch, Emily curled up with her book while the men shared stories that weren't about war but about ordinary things, how the forest smelled after rain, how quiet the stars felt when you'd finally earned peace enough to look at them. One late afternoon, as the sun slipped behind the ridge, the sky turned a deep orange that made even the ashes of old trees seem to glow. Emily set her book aside and looked up at her father, her voice thoughtful and quiet. "Dad," she asked, "are heroes always strong?" Jack blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. He turned toward her, his eyes soft. "No, sweetheart," he said after a moment. "Sometimes heroes are just people who love enough to keep going when everyone else has given up." She tilted her head, thinking. "Like Rex?" He smiled. "Like Rex. And maybe like you." She blushed, hiding her face against the dog's neck. Daniel chuckled softly from where he stood by the railing. "I'll drink to that," he said, raising his cup. The evening deepened into twilight, the forest wrapped in that gentle silence that always came before the stars. Fireflies began to spark through the grass, their tiny lights flickering like memories that refused to fade. Jack leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, listening to the faint murmur of the creek below the ridge. Daniel was whittling a small piece of pine into the shape of a wolf, the wood curling away beneath his knife with each slow stroke. Emily hummed under her breath, a tune she'd made up herself, something between a lullaby and a prayer. Rex lifted his head once, listening, then rested it back down, content. The last rays of the sun stretched long across the valley, painting the snowcaps in firelight. Jack stood, stretching his back, and looked toward the mountain trail that wound into the forest. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's take a walk before the light fades." Emily jumped to her feet, pulling her coat tight. Daniel followed, tucking the carved wolf into his pocket. Together, they walked the narrow path between the pines, their shadows long and soft against the forest floor. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of new blossoms and pine smoke. Above them, the sky turned from gold to violet, then to the deep blue of evening. They stopped at the ridge where the land opened into a wide view of the valley below, the same place where the fire had once glowed like a wound in the dark. Now it was peaceful, the rebuilt cabin standing small but steadfast in the distance. Emily reached down to pick up a pine cone, rolling it between her fingers. Jack rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but certain. "You see that light?" he asked, nodding toward the horizon where the sun broke its last line through the trees. "That's what we fight for. Not for medals, not for glory, but for this. So life keeps finding its way back." Emily looked up at him, then toward Daniel and Rex, who stood side by side in the amber glow. "It's beautiful," she said. Jack nodded. "It is." The wind whispered through the pines, soft and forgiving. The four of them stood there in the last warmth of the sun, Jack, Daniel, Emily, and Rex, their silhouettes framed against the orange light. No one spoke. There was no need. The valley below gleamed with the promise of another spring, and the world, for the first time in a long while, felt whole again. Sometimes, when the world grows quiet and the snow begins to fall again, I think about the people we seldom see, the ones who give a part of themselves so others might keep their light alive. They are not always soldiers or officers or names we read in the news. Sometimes they're just fathers, daughters, or a loyal friend with four paws, choosing kindness even when no one is watching. There is a kind of courage that doesn't shout. It moves softly, in the way a hand reaches out to help, or a heart chooses mercy when anger would be easier. It's that quiet strength that keeps the world from freezing over completely. If this story touched you, take a moment to think of those silent heroes around you, the ones who never ask for thanks but keep showing up anyway. Share your thoughts below. Tell me what this story made you feel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage and compassion. May God bless you wherever you are tonight, and may your heart always stay warm, even when the world feels cold.